Snow hammered the cabin walls like a war drum, but inside the fire's warmth felt thin against the storm brewing outside. Somewhere in that swirling white, danger was coming, fast, relentless, and wearing a familiar face. Gideon had faced blizzards, bullets, and betrayal, yet nothing unsettled him like the sound of approaching boots crunching over frozen ground. The air tightened, the doorway darkened. A man built for silence, a woman accused of murder, and a child who would stand between them and a violent man with nothing left to lose. When Ewan's shadow filled the doorway, Gideon knew trouble had finally come. The blow to his ribs dropped him to his knees, blood on the snow. And just as the boot came down, a small voice screamed, "Leave my papa alone!" That was the moment everything changed. The wind tore across the high country like a living thing, lashing Gideon Hart's face with ice and grit. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blurring the line between earth and sky until the world became nothing but a blinding, shifting white. His buckskin mare pushed forward through the drifts, muscles bunching with each labored step. Gideon rode low in the saddle, collar turned up against the cold. He was a man accustomed to silence, 6 winters spent alone among the pines and granite, with only the crack of his rifle and the hiss of a fire for company. Out here, words were scarce and trust even scarcer. But on this day, the silence broke. At first, it was nothing more than a thread of sound, almost lost to the roar of the wind. He might have dismissed it as the groan of a distant tree or the cry of some half-starved coyote. Yet something in it caught him. Too thin, too human. He reined in, head cocked, listening past the howl of the storm. There it was again, a small, fractured sob, a child's sob. A ripple of unease moved through him. In weather like this, minutes could mean the difference between life and death, and no child should be out here alone. Without hesitation, Gideon turned his horse toward the sound, guiding her into a narrow track between snow-laden evergreens. Branches bent under their frozen weight, shedding powder in sudden cold bursts as he passed. Each stride brought the sound closer, sharper, more desperate. Gideon's breath steamed in the bitter air, his gloved hands steady on the reins. Whoever was out there, he meant to find them, before the storm claimed them for good. The sound led Gideon to a fallen pine, half buried under a fresh drift. Behind it, curled tight like a bird fallen from its nest, was a little girl. Her skin was pale, lips tinged with blue, each breath shallow and uneven. 2 thin, soaked blankets clung to her small frame, pitiful armor against the killing cold. Gideon swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the snow. He crouched beside her, his rough, calloused hand resting gently on her shoulder. The girl's eyes flew open, wide, startled, the look of a creature cornered by the unknown. "Please, don't hurt my mama." Her voice trembled, barely more than a breath. Gideon froze for a heartbeat. In years of drifting across the frontier, he had heard many kinds of pleas, desperate, bargaining, defiant. This one carried the weight of fear too deep for a child to know. Somewhere out there, her mother was still in danger. But first, if the girl didn't get warm soon, there would be nothing left to save. "No one's going to hurt her," he said softly. The words came slow, steady, meant to anchor her. He shrugged off his heavy wool cloak, the smell of smoke and worn leather rising from it, and wrapped it snugly around her small frame. She was so light in his arms he feared a gust might take her. Lifting her carefully, Gideon settled her in the saddle and swung up behind. His arms drew the cloak tighter, holding her close against his chest. Through the layers of fabric he could feel her trembling, each shiver a silent cry against the winter's grip. The horse's hooves sank deep with each step, the storm pressing in from all sides. Gideon didn't push for speed. Too much haste could kill a mount in weather like this. But his jaw tightened with every minute lost. The fire waiting in his cabin was the only thing standing between her and death. Each time the wind howled through the pines, the girl's hands clutched at his coat, as if afraid the darkness itself might tear her away. "You're safe now, Lily," he murmured. It was the first time he'd spoken her name, and in the faintest flicker of her eyes he saw a fragile spark of trust. Only a few more miles, he thought. Just a few more miles to keep her alive. Once Lily was swaddled in his heavy wool cloak and settled near the cabin's fire, Gideon wasted no time. The girl's trembling fingers still clung to his coat as he gently pried them loose, promising he'd return. Then he stepped back into the storm. The wind had grown meaner, cutting sideways through the trees. The faint trail he'd seen earlier was already half buried. Small boot prints staggered and shallow, weaving through the drifts like the path of someone barely able to stand. Gideon crouched low to study them, reading the snow the way other men read books. Whoever he was following was slowing down, or running out of strength entirely. He pressed on, pushing through knee-deep powder, the cold gnawing at every seam in his coat. Branches clawed at him, scattering ice down his neck. His breath came hard, steaming in the frigid air. Somewhere ahead, the forest thinned toward a rocky outcrop, and that was where he saw her. She was half collapsed against the base of a pine. Snow drifted over her legs as if the earth itself were already claiming her. Her dress was torn, one arm hanging limp, skin flushed with the dangerous heat of a body freezing from the inside. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, and her eyelids fluttered with the last scraps of consciousness. Gideon knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. Her eyes opened just enough to find his, glazed but urgent. "Is she safe?" The words scraped out, raw and thin. "She's warm by the fire," he said quickly. Relief broke across her face, so quiet it barely touched her features. Then her body went slack, collapsing into his arms. Without a second thought, Gideon lifted her, cradling her as if she weighed no more than the child. The storm pressed in from every side, but he set his jaw and moved, each step deliberate and sure. Behind him, the wind carried on its restless howl, but in Gideon's mind there was only one task: get Clara Wynne back to the cabin alive. By the time he reached the door, snow had crusted over his hat and shoulders. Inside, the fire's glow spilled out to meet them, and for the first time since leaving, Gideon felt the cold lose some of its bite. Clara was still breathing. That was enough. For now. By the time Clara's breathing had steadied and the worst of the frostbite fears had passed, Gideon had heard enough whispers in his mind to recognize her name. Clara Wynne. He'd caught it once or twice in town, spoken in saloon corners over the clink of whiskey glasses. The men who told the story had no mercy in their tone. They said she'd shot her husband in cold blood, left him on the floor without a prayer, and fled into the night with her little girl. To them, she was a murderess, nothing more. But the woman lying in his cabin didn't look like a cold-blooded killer. She looked like someone who'd been holding the world back with her bare hands for too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, the words coming as if dragged from a place she didn't want to revisit. She didn't start with the night of the shooting. She started years before, with the first slap that came out of nowhere, followed by flowers the next day. Then came bruises in hidden places, broken ribs explained away with false smiles. "He'd drink," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire, and when the bottle ran dry, his temper filled the gap. After Lily was born, it got worse. She cried whenever he was near, and that made him angrier. Gideon didn't interrupt. He just let the story unravel. The night it happened, she told him, she had seen it in his eyes. Something final. Something that wouldn't stop until one of them was gone. He was drunk, shouting, his hands like iron. Lily had been screaming in the corner. Clara's hand found the pistol almost by instinct. "I didn't aim," she said, her voice raw. "I just wanted him to stop." But his brother was the sheriff. There would be no trial, no chance to explain. By dawn, she would hang. So she ran. No plan, no supplies, just her daughter and the clothes on their backs, heading for the kind of wilderness where lawmen didn't follow unless they had to. In the stillness of the cabin, Gideon saw the truth behind the rumor. She hadn't run because she was guilty. She'd run because she'd been given no other choice, and that was something a man like him understood all too well. Dawn crept slowly over the snowbound pines, washing the cabin in a pale blue light. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the crackle of the fire seemed loud. Gideon stood at the stove, tending a skillet of cornmeal and bacon, the smell drifting warmly through the room. Behind him, Clara still slept, her breathing steady, one arm curled protectively around her daughter. Lily stirred first, blinking in the unfamiliar light, her hair tangled from sleep. She slid off the cot quietly, bare feet padding across the rough plank floor until she reached Gideon. She tugged at the hem of his coat. He looked down, expecting some small request for food or water. Instead, her wide eyes met his with a seriousness far beyond her years. "Please marry my mama," she whispered. "She's all I have now." The words struck him harder than any blow. For a moment, he didn't move, the wooden spoon in his hand hovering above the skillet. In Lily's voice was no calculation, no fear, just the simple truth of a child who understood that safety, once found, could just as easily be lost. Gideon crouched to meet her gaze, searching her face. In her, he saw a shadow of another face. His sister's, decades gone now. She'd been sweet and gentle too, married young to a man who turned cruel. Folks in Kansas had said she must have done something to deserve it. No one had stepped in. By the time Gideon learned the truth, it was too late. She and her unborn child were gone. That memory had sat like a stone in his chest for years. And now, standing in his cabin with Lily's small hand clutching his coat, he felt the weight of it shift. He didn't answer her directly. Words didn't come easy to him. But he reached out and rested a hand gently on her head. "Eat first," he murmured, turning back to the stove. But inside, something had already settled. He might not be the marrying kind, but he knew this much. No one was going to take this child, or her mother, back into the darkness they'd escaped. Not while he was still breathing. The afternoon sun hung low, throwing long, blue shadows across the snow outside the cabin. Gideon was splitting firewood when the distant crunch of hooves reached his ears. He straightened, the axe still in his hand, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. 3 riders emerged from the pines, their horses steaming in the cold air. They didn't look like ranch hands. These men sat their saddles with the loose confidence of those who'd spent years on the hunt. Lean, weathered faces, eyes that measured everything. One wore a wide-brimmed hat so clean it looked out of place in the frontier. Another chewed a wad of tobacco lazily, spitting into the snow as they drew near. The third had the kind of precise posture that told Gideon he'd been a soldier once. The lead man, Clay by the sound of his partner's voice, reined in a few yards from the porch and unfolded a sheet of paper. The county seal stamped across the top was unmistakable. "Wanted," Clay read aloud, his gaze shifting to the cabin door. "Clara Wynne, fugitive, murdered her husband in Esserville. $500 dead or alive, though the sheriff prefers alive." Inside, Gideon could sense Clara stiffen. He didn't turn toward her, didn't need to. "She's under my protection," Gideon said, his voice flat as the frozen ground. "You want her, you'll have to come through me." The man with the tobacco chuckled. "500's a lot of money to stand in front of, friend." "I've seen better men than me buried by worse women than her," Gideon replied evenly. "But this one, she fought to live. You'll not take her from here." For a moment, the air seemed to tighten, each man gauging the other's resolve. Clay's jaw worked, his eyes scanning Gideon's stance. He folded the paper slowly, tucking it back into his coat. "You just bought her some time, Hart," he said finally. "That's all." "That's enough," Gideon answered. The 3 riders turned their horses, disappearing back into the trees. But their parting glance promised they'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't be so polite. Inside, the silence was heavy. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "They'll come again." Gideon set the axe down. "Then we'll be ready." That night, beneath the dim glow of a flickering lantern, Gideon sat at the worn wooden table in his cabin, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Clara and Lily rested quietly nearby, their steady breathing a fragile reminder of the calm after the storm. Gideon carefully unfolded a sheet of paper and dipped his quill into the ink. His fingers, calloused from years of labor and hardship, moved deliberately as he began to write. This letter was more than ink on parchment. It was a plea for justice, a testament to the truth no one else dared to tell. He chronicled the long years Clara had endured, each bruise concealed beneath layers of fabric, every broken rib, every moment of fear. He detailed the night that had changed everything, the desperation, the fear, the instinct to protect herself and her child. With steady hands, Gideon recounted the corruption that plagued their town, how the sheriff, Clara's late husband's brother, had twisted the law to serve his own interests, ensuring no trial would ever be fair. He wrote not just to defend Clara, but to expose the cruel realities she had lived. He sealed the letter with care, knowing the risks involved in speaking out, but willing to face them. This letter, destined for a trusted attorney in Esterville, was their last hope, the chance to clear Clara's name and reclaim their lives from shadow and suspicion. Gideon tucked the envelope away, resolved to send it at the first safe opportunity, and sat back, the weight of his decision settling upon him. In the cold wilderness, amid snow and silence, justice was a fragile thing, but it was a fight worth risking everything for. The quiet of the cabin was thick with unspoken thoughts. Clara sat near the hearth, her eyes tracing the dancing flames, gathering courage with each flicker. Lily was nestled safely in a corner, her soft breathing a comforting rhythm. Finally, Clara broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gideon, I don't want this to be a mere act, just a way to keep the bounty hunters at bay or fool the law. I want to marry you, for real." Gideon's gaze remained fixed on the fire. The idea of marriage had always seemed distant, even impossible, for a man who had wandered the frontier alone for so long. But now, faced with Clara's earnestness and the innocence in Lily's eyes, something shifted within him. He thought of his sister, how she had suffered in silence, how no one had stood for her when she needed it most. That memory, heavy and painful, stirred a protective resolve. Without a word, he reached out and gently took Clara's hand, his rough fingers brushing against her skin. The weight of his silence carried meaning. He was listening, understanding, and considering a future he hadn't dared to imagine. After a long moment, Gideon spoke, his voice steady and low. "If you want it, you have my name." Relief softened Clara's features, and a quiet hope filled the room. Lily's eyes fluttered open, as if sensing the new bond forming between them. That night, beneath the watchful gaze of stars beyond the cabin's walls, a promise was made, not out of necessity, but from a genuine desire to stand together. Gideon might have been a man of few words, but his heart was clear. He was ready to protect, to care, and to build something lasting with Clara and Lily, come what may. The day was unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that made Gideon's instincts prickle. He was mending a section of the cabin's fence when the sound of a single horse broke the silence. Looking toward the tree line, he saw a tall figure on a dark bay stallion, a man with a cruel set to his jaw and eyes that held no warmth. Ewan. Clara's breath caught when she stepped to the doorway and saw him. Her late husband's brother, the man who had turned a blind eye to her suffering, and worse, had helped keep her trapped. Ewan dismounted, boots crunching over the snow, a smirk twisting his mouth. "You think you can hide out here with my brother's wife?" He sneered at Gideon. Before Gideon could answer, Ewan closed the distance and drove a hard fist into his ribs. The blow knocked him backward, stealing his breath and sending him to one knee. Blood welled in his mouth, the metallic taste sharp against the cold air. Ewan loomed over him, ready to strike again. Then a small figure darted between them. Lily, her face flushed, eyes fierce despite the fear in them, threw her arms wide. "Leave my papa alone," she shouted, voice trembling but unyielding. For a moment, Ewan froze, startled by the defiance from someone so small. Gideon rose slowly, his breath ragged but his stance solid, moving to stand just behind Lily. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of steel. "You're done here, Ewan. You've got no claim, no right, and no welcome." Ewan's eyes narrowed, but Gideon didn't flinch. "If you touch her again, if you even come near this place, I'll make sure you disappear so deep not even the buzzards will bother with you." The tension hung heavy until Ewan finally stepped back, his smirk gone. He mounted his horse without another word, turning it toward the trees. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Gideon looked down at Lily. "You all right, little one?" She nodded, still clutching his coat. Clara, eyes shining with relief and pride, stepped forward to wrap them both in her arms. The fight was over, for now, but Gideon knew the war to protect them was far from finished. The winter sun was thin but bright the morning Gideon rode into town. In his coat pocket was a sealed envelope he had been waiting weeks to receive. The county clerk, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, handed it to him with a polite nod. The red wax bore the official seal. Back at the cabin, Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Lily played quietly near the hearth, humming to herself. Gideon stepped inside, shook the snow from his shoulders, and placed the envelope in front of Clara. Her fingers hesitated at the seal, afraid of what it might hold. But when she finally broke it open and read the words, her lips parted in disbelief. "Cleared," she whispered. They called it self-defense." Relief washed over her like a long-awaited thaw. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear or exhaustion. They were from the sudden weight lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in months, the future was not a dark road with no end. Lily rushed to her mother's side, peering up at the letter she didn't fully understand. "Does this mean we can stay?" she asked. Clara nodded, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "It means we're safe now." Lily turned to Gideon then, eyes wide and shining. Without hesitation, she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're my papa now, right?" Gideon knelt so he could meet her gaze. His rough, calloused hands cupped her small face gently. "Been waiting to be, little one," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that reached deeper than any fire. That evening, the three of them shared a simple meal. Stew simmered over the flames, fresh bread, and laughter that felt new yet entirely natural. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now held the sound of voices, the rustle of movement, and the kind of quiet that comes only when you're no longer alone. Outside, the snow lay untouched under the silver light of the moon. Inside, they sat close to the hearth, the fire casting golden light over their faces. Clara rested her head against Gideon's shoulder. Lily curled against them both, already drifting toward sleep. In that moment, there were no bounty hunters, no rumors, no shadows of the past, only the steady crackle of the fire and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Somewhere out in the wild expanse of the West, danger still roamed. But in this small cabin under the pines, love had carved out a refuge. And for Gideon, Clara, and Lily, it was the beginning of something they had each thought they'd never find again. A home. And so, in the frozen heart of the Colorado borderlands, three people who had been broken in different ways found something they thought they'd lost forever: a place to belong. Gideon, Clara, and Lily's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't fought with guns or fists, but with the simple choice to stand by someone when the world has turned against them. In today's America, the frontier may be gone, but the battles are still here. We still see neighbors judged before the truth comes out. We still meet people carrying silent scars, hoping someone will believe them. And we still face moments where we must decide whether to walk away or stand in the doorway like Gideon did, refusing to let harm pass. Maybe this story is about the West, but it's also about us, about protecting those who can't protect themselves, about building a family not just from blood, but from loyalty and love. But here's the question I'd like to leave you with. If someone like Clara crossed your path today, misunderstood, accused, and alone, would you take the risk to defend them? Or would fear and doubt push you to step aside? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinion in the comments. Do you think Gideon made the right choice in marrying Clara? And what would you have done in his boots? Let's start that conversation. Thank you for riding along with us in this tale from the West that never left. If this story touched your heart, taught you something, or simply gave you a moment's escape, please consider giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who'd appreciate its message. Because here, the West never truly rides away, and there's always another story waiting just beyond the horizon.